Bryce Beemer. Welcome to our program. It's called Chautauqua. Chautauqua is a living history humanities program where scholars and actors perform as extraordinary people in history. This year's theme is seeking justice. Justice has been defined as even-handedness, fair play, and equity. It can be the result of applying laws impartially or viewed as fairness in the protection of rights and the punishment of wrongs. Tonight's Chautauqua character dedicated his whole life to seeking justice for enslaved and oppressed people in the United States and abroad. He was born a slave, but became a statesman, an orator, an abolitionist, and a writer. Tonight's Chautauqua character is the brilliant Frederick Douglass.
Good evening, good citizens. I was just having dinner with the president, and I'm a little tardy, but I'm told I don't have much time to tell you about the 77 years of my life that I have lived, so let me get on with it. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all the other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is a constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Your boasted liberty an unholy license. Your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sound of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns. Your sermons and thanksgivings with all of your religious parade and solemnity are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States at this very hour. Greetings. I know. But you see, that was an excerpt from a speech I gave in 1852. And I introduce it to you here now because I need you to understand what was going on in your country in 1850s. I had been fighting for a long time since I escaped in 1838 at 20 years old for justice, seeking justice, only dignity and respect and fairness. That's all we were asking for. And so we come up to 1850, and the scoundrels who had been trying to disparage the Constitution and say that it was a document designed to approve slavery, those scoundrels had their moment in the sun. They met together and came up with a compromise in 1850 that included some softies, some nice, sweet little nuggets. One of them, they brought California into the Union as a free state. They brought the New Mexico and Utah territories into the Union. They even abolished the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Not slavery, mind you, just a trade. But in return for that, what did they require? What did they demand? They demanded the fugitive slave clause from 1793 be extended and tightened so that any person escaping from slavery, seeking justice, and going to a free state was required to be returned by any citizen of the country. It required that the United States Marshal to go out and capture people and return them back to slavery. And he would pay $1,000 per person to do so. But if he or anybody else failed to do so, they could be fined $1,000. Not only that, the United States Marshal was authorized, encouraged, and commanded to deputize any other citizen to capture any fugitive and return them to slavery. And that was in 1850. And that was the compromise that they made in 1850. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin and revealed, for the first time, I think, to many of the citizens of the country, the horrendous nature of slavery. Most people not only were not aware, now they could see the scuffles walking down the street with people with chains on their legs and on their arms and around their neck and naked and moaning and groaning and being whipped with a lash. They could see that. So how in the world do you get a people to understand that those people are not supposed to be people? How do you convince them that they are not seeing something that is wrong? Well, you tell them that these are not people at all through the law, that they are not smart, that they are brutes and beasts, and they are not capable of handling civilization. And you tell them that long enough, loud enough, and often enough, and people will believe it. And not only will they watch them march down that street, but they would also kick them and spit at them as they walked down the street. And so in 52, Uncle Tom's Cabin, 54, they repealed the Missouri Compromise by passing the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Missouri Compromise said that you could have slaves in all the states where you have color and have them, but you can't extend it out into the territories as the nation expands. That's what the compromise in Missouri was. Well, if you brought in a slave state, you had to bring in a free state. Bring in a free state, you had to bring in a slave state. But you can't expand it beyond in the territory where we don't currently have slaves. Well, the Kansas and Nebraska said, excuse me, we don't like that. The slave power said, here's what we want to do now. Why don't we create a little thing called popular sovereignty? And popular sovereignty sounds wonderful. It simply means that you, in your state, get to decide whether you want to have slavery or freedom. But they didn't stop there. They took some slave owners and slave apologists and slave supporters and slave scallions and sent them into these states like Kansas and had them clamor for slavery. In 1857, they passed something called the Dred Scott decision. The Supreme Court ruled on Dred Scott. And in there he said that Negroes were not people. I told you that the citizens believed that these people were animals and that they did not deserve freedom. Well, here's why. The Supreme Court of the United States said so. It said, these are not people. When the founding fathers wrote the Constitution, they didn't intend to include these people. They have no rights that anybody is bound to respect. That was in 1857. In 1858, Abraham Lincoln began to run for office. During that time, the Whig Party went out, the Republican Party came in. Can you see the clamor that was going on? And all the time, the slave powers were telling you that slavery was on its way out. I would love to see what slavery looked like if it was just coming in, if this is the sign that it's on its way out. In 1860, when Abraham Lincoln won the nomination, he was not the president yet. He was not sworn in. He couldn't be sworn in until next March. He just won the nomination. And South Carolina said, we quit. They seceded from the Union. In contravention to all of the published doctrine of the time that this was meant to be one nation under God, they decided that they would go out. And so you see, citizens, in the 1850s, I had a fight on my hands. And I was constantly clamoring to get people to understand that this was our fight and deserving of us. Why? Why was I so vocal in this battle? Well, I had been a slave. Was born into slavery. I was born in 1818. The Constitution of the United States was 31 years old when I was born. 31. A youth. Fair-haired youth. Waiting to be activated and executed. Waiting for somebody to define what it really meant. And so I was born into that generation that was going to define it, but it didn't cover me according to the slave powers. And when we grew up right on the eastern shore in Talbot County, born on Tuckahoe Creek. And the scuttlebutt was that he got his name Tuckahoe because a man was out hoeing by the water, and a young lad kept patting him on the shoulder. He told him to leave him alone. He wouldn't. He took a hoe and hit him in the head. So they call it the Tuckahoe Creek. I don't know about that, but I tell you this. When I was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. And my mother gave birth to me and cuddled me and suckled me a couple of days and then walked 12 miles and handed me off to my grandmother. My grandmother taught me how to be a child and let me run around and play with the chickens until I was 7 years old. And then she cuffed me up and walked me down to Y Mills Plantation. And in Y Mills Plantation, I turned to follow my grandmother back home, which is what I always did. But this time, she was already gone. And all the children looked out and said, "Fatty, she ain't coming back." And that was my introduction to slavery. Slavery and slaves have no family. You are not a person. You are property. Nothing belongs to you. Everything you are and everything you have and everything you do belongs to the person who owns you. And so I was running around learning to be a slave. And fortunately, I knew who my mother was, but I did not know who my father was. The scuttlebutt had it that my master was my father. This is not unusual. Imagine a situation in which you are allowed to own people that you can buy, and you own all sexes. What would you do to increase the value of your property? Think closely about that. And so an awful lot of mulatto slaves were hanging around because it increases the value of the master's stock. This is savagery. So I was growing up and learning to be a slave, but I noticed that Aunt Katie, the lady who was in charge of me, she was herself a slave, but she was the overseer, and she didn't like me at all. She beat me up and kicked me around and shoved me all kinds of places. I tried to be good, and I didn't know how. I was trying to do what everybody else did. And so Miss Lucretia was the daughter to Aaron Anthony. Aaron Anthony was the actual master. Now, Colonel Lloyd owned the Y Mills plantation. He must have had up to 1,000 slaves. But each segment had its own overseer. But Aaron Anthony had his several farms, and he also was the overseer of all the overseers. But my family belonged to Aaron Anthony, and Lucretia Anthony was his daughter. And this Miss Lucretia, my sister, took a liking to me. Now, I tell you, nobody ever said that she was my sister. Nobody ever said Aaron Anthony was my father, except a couple of the slaves. But she took a liking to me, and she always gave me cakes when Aunt Katie would punish me and starve me. But then it came time for her to do something spectacular. And she assigned me to be the playmate of Daniel Lloyd, who was the son of Colonel Lloyd, who was the big planter. And Daniel Lloyd, of course, had all of the privileges and rights and access to things. Well, I didn't have all the privileges and rights and access. I was his playmate. Or maybe a better word is his plaything. But Daniel Lloyd was 12 years old, and he had not been taught how to be a slave master. And I was 7 years old, and I had not been taught yet how to be a slave. So Daniel Lloyd and I played a lot. And wherever Daniel Lloyd would go, Freddie would go right along. And look, there are two things I learned from Daniel Lloyd. First, pay attention to everything around you. And second, be curious. Daniel Lloyd had to pay attention to everything around him because he was taught that slaves were sneaky. They would always try to escape, run off. And they would always give you an excuse for doing something that they weren't supposed to be doing. So he was being trained for that, but I was being trained to find out, okay, what is going on with these people with all the power, and why do we have none? And I was paying attention, and I noticed that Daniel Lloyd would go in and see a tutor about once or twice or 3 times a week. Now, I was not allowed in to see the tutor, but Daniel Lloyd was always going in, and they would learn and teach, and he would come back, and sometimes, just by chance, he would practice some of what he was learning. I was paying attention, and I was curious. But I also learned that learning is very important in Daniel Lloyd's life, but it's not important in mine. They came when Miss Lucretia got married, and she was married to Thomas Auld. And Thomas Auld had a brother that lived in Baltimore. His name was Hugh. And Hugh and Thomas had a conversation. Hugh told Thomas he needed somebody up there to be a playmate for his kid, Tommy. And Miss Lucretia looked at me, and she said, Freddie, you going to Baltimore. And she took me, and she squished my hair down. She pulled my little gingham shirt down. Now, you need to understand, the slave children did not wear anything but this little gingham shirt. It was rough. You had to sleep in it. You had to eat in it. It was yours. And you only got 2 a year, so you better take care of it as best you could. And for most children, it came down to about their knees, but I was a big child. And it came down just about to respectability. But on this day, sending me to Baltimore, Miss Lucretia gave me some breeches and gave me some shoes and put me on a boat going to Baltimore. And I got to Baltimore, and well, first of all, I wish I had time to tell you about the sights that I saw going past Annapolis and going up the river. I'll tell you, it felt like I was going to heaven. No, it felt like I was in heaven going to whatever is after that. I was really excited, and I felt free. I got to Baltimore, and there was Mr. Hugh and his wife, Miss Sophie, and little Tommy sitting there waiting for me. And Mr. Hugh was trying to look stern, like he was a slave master. And little Tommy was emulating his daddy. Miss Sophie was standing there smiling. He said, Freddie, come here. This is your friend, little Tommy. And they took me and put me in the loft, and the days began. And thus began my journey in Baltimore and my journey towards justice, because I was in close enough proximity now to see things that I could not see out on the plantation, to see things that I could not understand or hear. But now I'm in the house, up in the loft, with no closure. And so I can see and hear a lot. Mr. Hugh every day was running he had a company down on the docks. And he would take me down to help him out. But frequently he would take little Tommy and take him off to a tutor. I was watching. But Miss Sophie every morning got up and read the Bible. And she would read it out loud. And then she would tell the stories herself and act them out. Sometimes she'd sing. But she was having a good time by herself. And I was up in the loft. One day I came down, was hanging on the ladder, and looked around, and she was talking about Jacob's ladder. And looked around, and there I was hanging on this ladder. And she said, you like that story? I said, yeah, yes, ma'am. I wish I could read a story like that. She said, you do? You mean you want to learn to read? I said, yes, ma'am. Remember I told you that ordinary citizens did not understand slavery? She did not understand slavery. She married into it. And she did not understand that she was not supposed to teach a slave to read. But she was about to learn this lesson because she started teaching me. And she was teaching me with an urgency because I was learning so fast. I was learning, I was pushing her. And I was learning so fast that one day Mr. Hugh walked into the room, into the house, and she said, oh, Hugh, you ought to hear Freddie read. He can read almost as good as little Tommy. What'd she say that for? Mr. Hugh puffed up like a bullfrog. He turned bright red in the face, and he looked at his wife as if he was going to kill her and said, woman, are you crazy? Teaching a slave to read will unfit him for slavery for life. I was hiding behind the chair. But my ears were still open. And I remember two things from Daniel Lloyd. Pay attention and be curious. My attention said, what did he just say? He confirmed what I had thought when I was with Daniel Lloyd. That learning is the one thing that separates slavery from freedom. And he had just taught me that from that day forward, nobody ever would come between me and my learning. I began a mission of learning from the day I walked out of that door. Mr. Hugh would take me and send me off and hire me out to different people. And I was like a child just reading everything I could, as best I could. But I didn't know how to read very well, so I needed some tutoring. So I decided to enlist the aid of everybody I ran into. Most of the children in the neighborhood, I would go out and play with them and find out what they knew about reading and have them get me something. Let's read. That was my motto. Let's just read. As I grew up, Mr. Hugh put me down on the docks. I was a caulker. And I noticed that all these foreign workers would take these crates off the ships. They'd read something on them and go write something on another one. And so they were just reading and writing. And so I said, you know what? I think I could enlist their help in my education. Now, I need to tell you that every time Mr. Hugh hired me out to somebody, I was paid, but the money belonged to him. You remember now, slaves are property, not people. Therefore, I could not earn any money for myself. It was his money. So I take the money that I worked for. I worked for it, but I had to come and give it to him. And I noticed two things. Pay attention and be curious. The attention said, he likes it when you work harder and bring more money. The curiosity said, what would happen if I brought him so much money that he'd give me some back? Which is exactly what began to happen. I'd bring him money so frequently, he'd give me a little bit back, and I'd put it in my satchel. And so when I'm down on the docks, I got a little money in my satchel, and all these dock workers are reading, and I decided to challenge them one day. I walked up with one, I said, tell you what, I bet I can read better than you. He said, I bet you can't. I said, bet I can. And we went on and on and on like that until I pulled my money out of my satchel and put it on the table. I said, put your money up. And he put his money up and looked at me. I said, you go first. And he goes, and I'd come right behind him. And I'd always miss a word or two. And he'd always grab my money and take off laughing. He called me all kinds of fools, and he didn't realize that he was accepting my tuition for my education. Well, I got to the point where I got tired of being a slave, and I had to leave. And so I'm leaving an awful lot out because I don't have the kind of time that I'd like to have. I was 20 years old when Anna Murray and Anna had given me the Liberator, a periodical written and edited by William Lloyd Garrison. And I'd read about abolition and freedom and abolition societies. And all the time I was getting more and more anxious to find this justice that I read was in the Constitution. See, John Quincy Adams was in the paper, and he was also in the Columbia Orator. And the Columbia Orator was another magazine book that had all kinds of speeches and dialogues. It had a dialogue between a slave and a master in which the slave was holding his own. I said, oh, that's me. At any rate, learning all of that, Anna and I put together a scheme. I'd been noticing, paying attention, right, that on the ships, the sailors on the ships always had these elaborate costumes with a red bandana around the neck and a little jacket and a little beret. And they always had a little pass with an eagle on it. Now, if you were a slave, you had to have a permission written and signed by your master to be outside of any supervision. If you're a free person, you got to have a pass issued by the state that says you are a free person, and it was renewed every year. So now, the slave and the free man, black, has to have these passes. But if you're a sailor, you had to have a pass, but you can always get access by the little pass gave you special permission as a sailor. It was a little paper that had an eagle imprinted on it. And Anna and I discovered that we could get one of those. They had the description of the person on it, and the one I got didn't have a description that came close to me, but I noticed something else, paying attention and being curious, that the sailors never had these passes examined. They would just flash them at the conductor and say, I fly with the eagle. And the conductor would wave them on through. And that was the value of the sailor's life, a veteran. And so we fabricated the costume and the pass and decided that I was going to catch a train right there at Baltimore Harbor and get out of here. And I went down and waited till the last minute, had the porter, whom I knew, to bring my bags. At the last minute, the train starts going. I jumped the train and went in and sat in the deepest corner in the colored car. And I just waited. I knew the conductor was going to come. And when he did, he looked at me and says, you got your free papers? I said, I don't need free papers. Why? I fly with the eagle. He said, okay. Daniel Lloyd didn't know what he had taught me. I took the train all the way up to Havre de Grace. Had to stop, get off. Every time we came to a river, and these days you had to stop, get off the train, get on a ferry, go across the water, then get back, get another train and keep going. And so we went that right to Wilmington, Delaware, right to Philadelphia, making those changes. And every time we changed transportation, it was another opportunity for me to be captured. And I was afraid deeply, because one of the things you learn as a slave is that only one or two times will you get captured and return to your master, especially if you were a slave in Maryland and Delaware, in the northern part of the slave states. The big opportunity came when you could be sold down the river, down to Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia. And that was hard to escape from. Well, I got to New York. I told you my name was Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. When I got to New York, the first thing I had to do was change my name. The slave catchers are looking for Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. And I met a fellow by the name of Ruggles. And Mr. Ruggles took me and put me on the Underground Railroad. He took me and put me up and told me these stories, told me a magnificent story about, written by, he said, about Sir Walter Scott, called The Lady of the Lake. And in that story was a legend of a knight they called the Black Douglass. And the Black Douglass was so fearsome that everybody feared the king because they thought he'd put the Black Douglass on them. And I love that story. I couldn't wait for him to finish it. He asked me, what is your name? I at first chose Johnson. And he said, friend, every slave that escapes wants to be named Johnson. He said, pretty soon, all the slave catchers have to do is come up and arrest everybody named Johnson, and they'll have most of the runaways. But when I heard the story of the Black Douglass, I said to him, that's going to be my name. Douglass. He spelled it D-O-U-G-L-A-S, and he was the protector of the king. And I told Mr. Ruggles, I'm going to add an S on the end because I want to be the protector of the slave. And so my name is spelled D-O-U-G-L-A-S-S. I went on up to New Bedford and started working. And that work led me to the Anti-Slavery Society and William Lloyd Garrison. And thus began my life all over again. Oh, there's so much I would love to tell you, and I will, but it won't be on this trip because I only had a limited amount of time. But I do have time, I think, to take your questions. So let me stop here and thank you very kindly for your attention. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for staying with us. I'm here with Bill Grimmette, who's just performed as Frederick Douglass. He's a storyteller, motivational speaker, actor, and history interpreter. Thank you for coming back to Montgomery College because we've had a chance to talk before with some of your other characters and also with another Frederick Douglass character you did a few years ago.
Yes, I did a Frederick Douglass before with that dime store wig on.
Oh. Very good. Costumes are probably hard to find. The fact that you have gotten so many different ones, like the Benjamin Banneker one that you had a few years ago, that was very, very intricate.
Yeah.
But to keep things historically accurate, it's probably a real search.
Well, exactly right. And the biggest thing was finding somebody to make a Frederick Douglass wig. And just finding a wig maker is not easy to do. So I had to track one down, and then you have to order it, and it's, so it's a process. But I'm glad I did.
Yeah, we are too. We are too. The audience really enjoyed your performance, and so did I. I wanted to talk with you about Frederick Douglass as the writer first. He was an incredible writer. His writing is so dense and rich. It's so full. It's not sparse at all.
Yeah.
And his vocabulary, he doesn't say the same things often. He just really has such a rich vocabulary. It's wonderful to read.
Yes. And everybody says so. Everybody, meaning his contemporaries, talked about his writing and how they said it's so organized and so orderly, but it's not. It's prose that reads almost like poetry because it has a rhythm that you can discover. And he quotes from some of the most magnificent references that anybody can imagine. That you would expect that he was a Harvard graduate. He's quoting Shakespeare, he's quoting the Bible, he's quoting Thackeray, he's quoting Hobbes. And so, When did he read all this stuff?
Indeed. He describes slavery like no one else I've ever read. The idea of his first-person account is again so full, and it really sort of puts you there, and you can feel the things that he's talking about.
That's true. His object, it seemed to be, even from the beginning, was to picture slavery, was to pit slavery against the Constitution, and have you look at it from what the founders said we were supposed to be, and what the scoundrels, he called them. So it was a sort of the founders' scoundrels kind of a split. The scoundrels, who were the slaveholders, wanted the Constitution to reflect. And so his whole life was about juxtaposing those two things for us to look at it. And it was basically saying, as Shakespeare says, look in that glass and tell the face that you're looking at now that this is who you want to be.
And he discovered who he wanted to be at an early age. He realized that slavery was not, he did not want that to be his station in life, and he worked toward moving out of it and continued to develop himself.
Exactly. And I think the most important thing that he ever did was that he decided not that he was just going to be free, but his life's mission was to free everybody else. That's a whole different perspective. There were an awful lot of really prominent men and women who had escaped slavery, who had educated themselves, some of them had gone on to college, who were working for abolition, but they never made it their mission to be the representative of all the slaves. When he walked out of slavery, that was his intent. And that's a whole different, so it gave him a different urgency and a different desire to always be more. He was one of the most photographed people in the 19th century. But the reason was because he said most of the people that he was representing couldn't read because of slavery, and he wanted them to see an image of a man who had made it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Good, very good point. The idea that he didn't want to exclude the people he was trying to help.
Exactly.
To seek justice for.
Yeah, precisely.
Mm-hmm. He didn't seem to have a lot of bitterness in his writing. He seemed to have told the story, but not with bitterness or malice.
That's true, and he actually speaks to that. He says, when I learned what learning was, one of the things I noticed was learning is based on reason and not emotion. He said, slavery made me angrier than most people, but I can't convince anybody to do anything by using my anger. He said, every time I try to fight somebody because I'm angry, they get angrier, But when I'm using reason, they have to think. So he deliberately fashioned his talks and his speeches and his writings so that he was not playing on the emotions of anger, but on reason.
And that worked. That worked.
Yes.
He was very convincing, very persuasive.
When he talked to Abraham Lincoln and he became friends, and they didn't have that many meetings. Mm-hmm. But they were friends because they were reasonable men. Yeah.
Yeah, he writes about his meetings with Lincoln, and he disagreed with. He went to talk with Lincoln for one meeting about the condition of the black soldiers and not having equal pay and the type of treatment they would receive if they were captured by the Confederacy. And and Lincoln didn't really do anything. He listened compassionately, but the political change did not happen right away.
Well, but he explained to Frederick Douglass why it could not happen right away. He said, and this was the real big part of that conversation. Lincoln said, "You accuse me of vacillating." He said, "Let me explain something to you. I know that we want equality for all the soldiers." He said, "But you notice up north, they're rioting because of black soldiers in the army. And the Union soldiers are deserting and fighting in the army." He said, "You can't move as president until you prepare the people for the move that you're about to make. He said, Milliken's Bend, Fort Wagner, and Port Hudson were 3 battles that black soldiers had been heroic. He said, those things gave me permission for this little proclamation of mine. And so Frederick Douglass, when he walked out of there, understood that he was not vacillating because he was a vacillator. He was vacillating because of a very good reason. It was political implications that he had to take into consideration. You don't have to like that, he said, but you have to respect it.
Yes, yeah. And Douglass said that he wasn't cut out to be a politician.
Exactly.
Because he was urged to run for some office, but he didn't. When he was sent to Baltimore, he writes that he thought that it was divine providence that he was chosen to leave that farm and to be sent to Baltimore, because it opened up a whole world. Not all pleasant, but a whole world.
That's
gave him
right.
the opportunity.
Well, that's right. He could have been sold down the river. He went, when he was 16 years old, he was sent to a slave breaker and got into a fight with the slave breaker and whipped him. The slave breaker could have had him killed right there, but he didn't. He sent him back to his master. His master, and he didn't get along. He had tried to get somebody to escape. His master sent him back to Baltimore. Now, this was astonishing, because this is the same master that sent him to a slave breaker. And nobody knows exactly why. Well, Frederick Douglass tells a story. He said a lot of the people in the community, because he was trying to help other slaves to escape, were out to get him. And they had gotten their shotguns, and his master said, I better get you out of here before they kill you. And so he sent him back to Baltimore. So that's what I think what he means by divine providence, is that his master could have killed him, or let him be killed, and didn't. Yes.
Right. Reading was truly a key for him. He saw that education and slavery were incompatible, and reading was the thing that really helped him sort of break away. I think I heard something or read something in one of his books. Could his mother read?
His mother could, and yeah, she could, but she didn't teach him. Because she didn't spend any time with him.
Yes, she couldn't.
By the time he got to that point, she died.
Right.
And so, but yeah, she was apparently one that he had heard that could get some information for the people on the plantations. Yeah, but yeah, for him, it was not so much that he could read, but he learned what he should read, and that was another big key in his life. You know, a lot of people learned to read, and they read the Bible and practiced the Bible, but didn't read a whole lot of anything else. Well, most of the documents that he needed to read that was keeping them in slavery was not based on the Bible. It was based upon the law. And so he learned to read books that was determined on the law, which made a big difference in his life and who he became.
Can you tell us a little bit about what he wrote and said about the religious slaveholders?
They said so much. He was in Scotland at a temperance meeting, and there was a doctor of divinity there talking about temperance. But in there he said that Negroes did not belong in the temperance union, they belonged as slaves, and that the slaveholders were right because they were following biblical principles. This is a doctor of divinity, right? And Frederick Douglass lit into him, and he said, listen to me. Tyranny always needs God on their side because they don't want to obey any law, and they obey God because they can make up what God said. And so the reason somebody made him a minister as soon as he escaped, and he spent 3 years, and he said, I can't do that. He said, because I know that that's all superstition. The slave powers need the superstition to get you to believe whatever they tell you that God said. And his master was a Sunday school teacher, so he had a lot of words to say about how they had manipulated religion to justify slavery. Yeah.
Because some of the slaveholders that he encountered in Maryland in particular were some of the most pious people who prayed 3 times a day and were still beating.
His immediate master was his Sunday school teacher, and always wanted to pray before we whipped him.
Goodness.
You know.
Can you tell me a little bit more about his feelings about how Reconstruction was working?
Well,
or not?
Well, Reconstruction was working well until the slave powers got their powers back. He agreed. Rutherford B. Hayes became the president in 1876, and immediately pulled the federal troops out of South Carolina and Virginia, and that opened up the spigots because the gangs, the Ku Klux Klan and different gangs, began to kill people who were in office. And all those 1,500 people who had gotten office, black people who had gotten into office, and a lot of the liberals who had come from the North, they call them carpetbaggers, and a lot of the liberal Southerners who were abolitionists, they began to kill them and get them out of office and turned Reconstruction on its head. And Frederick Douglass felt helpless after a while. Because they had allowed that. And that Supreme Court decision in '83, he said, was another thing that helped that along. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And can you tell us a little bit, because we're short on time at this point, it's gone so fast. Can you tell us a little bit about what he did after the anti-slavery organizations were dismantled because slavery was not legal anymore?
Well, he fought William Lloyd Garrison and a whole lot of other people not to close them down. He would not shut them down. They tried to shut them down in '63 when in the middle of the Civil War. And he said, no, slavery existed. They were doing that because of the Emancipation Proclamation. Then in '65, when the war was over, they wanted to dismantle again. He said, no, people are still enslaved. They need help. They don't know where to go. So he was actually fighting hard to keep those organizations intact. It is hard to say when they all dismantled because they were doing it piecemeal, but it was probably during the middle of Reconstruction when they got the 15th Amendment passed and they got to vote, because his big issue was if you got no vote, you got no leverage. And he had a problem with the women's movement. They didn't like him because they split that vote. Either the blacks or the women got to vote. Well, he said, look, we can't help that, but we need the vote, because we don't have any power.
Right.
And so then it was only after then that they began to dismantle those organizations.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. And he had an illustrious career once he got to Washington, once he moved to Washington.
Oh yeah, he had about 5 different appointments by presidents of the United States, right? And some of them, they were not prominent positions because it was just hard for them politically to do that. But they were positions to make sure that they were recognizing his stature.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here again. We hope to see another character next time. Thank you for joining us. You've been watching Chautauqua Seeking Justice. I'm Angela Rice Beemer from the Germantown campus of Montgomery College. Good night.